So, the next speaker is somebody very, very unique and special, Hussein Askary, who is the Southwest Asia, some people, that's a new term for the whole Middle East, coordinator of the Schiller Institute. He also, for many, many years, has contributed to the Executive Intelligence Review as economic and strategic analyst on the Southwest Asia area and North Africa. He, as some may say, he doesn't look like the standard Swede, even though that is changing. Originally comes from Iraq and had to get out under very nasty circumstances as many others. But that became a blessing, at least for our organization, because Hussein, through Norway, ended up to become part of the International LaRouche organization in 1994, and has since then been contributing quite fantastically to our international work. And he is one of the authors of the originally the new land, the new Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge Report, but then also made a decision that this cannot simply stay in the English language or Chinese. This also has to be in the Arabic language. So Hussein took it upon himself to translate this to the Arabic language, and then also, of course, write some extra parts to it, which is necessary for the present circumstances in Southwest Asia to have it in. So this report just came out. It was released on March 17, actually, in Cairo, in a meeting where presided on by the Egyptian transportation minister, who then introduced Hussein, and the hope, of course, is that this will become something read and studied and acted on in the whole Arabic world as well as the rest of the world. So, Hussein, Peter, are you ready? Okay.
Do I need this too?
No. You have your own,
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom. I think you have heard Helga today giving a very stern and sobering warning about the state of affairs in the world, the dangers that are very real to the world today. What I'm going to do, and please don't misunderstand me, I'm not going to give you a picture of how rosy and nice things are, either in the Southwest Asia, so-called Middle East, or in Africa are, but you have to keep, as they say in sport, keep your eye on the ball. What Helga said is that there is a new paradigm in the world which can lead to a completely different and new world order. And it's that paradigm within which myself, the Schiller Institute, and the people we are talking to, we want to direct their attention into that new paradigm. I'm thankful for Lena for the beautiful singing, and especially the Aida aria. And it was actually played at the opening of the Suez Canal, the second Suez Canal, last year. You know, the idea of great projects, the idea of great challenges, like Helga was explaining, this idea of being in space, looking at the world from space, and also the idea of major projects like the Suez Canal, like the Three Gorges Dam in China, the new Silk Road. The effect they have on people is that they challenge their imagination and challenge their creativity, because they represent major difficulties, major technical problems, intellectual problems that have to be solved before you achieve these major projects. And that transforms the idea of people. It also gives people an idea of a creative, constructive identity and the position of man in the world, on this earth, but also on the universe. That's why we try to work on these concepts of the new Silk Road, extension of the new Silk Road, to inspire people to think outside of the box of the geopolitics, which Helga was trying to explain. We have to get out of geopolitics, we have to act human again, but that has practical implications. There are practical problems and other issues, and even scientific issues we have to resolve. So this is, for those who don't know, not familiar with, this is the extension of the New Silk Road. The New Silk Road has existed as a strategic policy of China since 1996, but we want to expand this into a global collaboration, a blueprint, as Tom said, for peace and cooperation among nations. So we have to connect the economic belt of the Silk Road is the one with the shade, with the yellow, which already is being built. As Helga said, the first train arrived from China to Tehran last month. There are projects going on in Siberia, so there are trains going from Asia to Europe. There is no problem with that. We need to extend it into the Southwest Asia region, the so-called Middle East. I can explain later why I say Southwest Asia, not the Middle East, and into Africa, and of course into the Americas. So you can see that the red lines are where we have the biggest deficit in infrastructure, both transportation infrastructure, but also in other means like deficit in water, deficit in electricity. So what is different in the Arabic part, which I rewrote certain parts of it, like the Southwest Asia part, we added the Arabian Peninsula also to the idea of the connection to the New Silk Road. So this is no longer simply a Silk Road. This is the World Land Bridge, which can unite all the continents of the world. In 1996, I had the great fortune to work with Helga Tsep-Larouche and the team of EIR to make the first major study of the New Silk Road. And it was that one which was adopted by the Chinese government as the strategic policy of China. It was also a thick report like this. So this work is being done mostly in East Asia, in Central Asia, Iran, Turkey, Russia. All these nations are involved, but what is lacking is the connection into the rest. So it has gone 20 years since that idea emerged, but there was no response from the countries in the Arab world, for example, or in Africa. Now, the idea of all these lines are not only about trade. We want to warn people. We are not talking about moving goods from China to Europe. That's not our concept. That's a byproduct. What we mean by all these, by the New Silk Road, the World Land Bridge, is that we need to create development corridors. A development corridor where you bring power, water, technology to areas that are landlocked, that are far from industrial zones, and explore the resources, human and natural resources of that region to develop new centers of economic activity. Like landlocked nations like in Central Asia. You have in the Great Lakes region so that's the concept. It's not about trade, although trade is an important aspect of this. In 2002, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, American economist and political leader, husband of Mrs. LaRouche, he was in Abu Dhabi in a conference about oil and the role of oil in world politics and the future of oil. And Mr. LaRouche, there were many ministers of oil actually from the Arab countries. The gentleman to the right is the oil minister or energy minister of the United Arab Emirates. And he shocked everybody, said that the Arab countries or the Gulf countries have to gradually stop exporting raw oil and actually use raw oil and gas as an industrial product for petrochemicals, plastics, where every barrel of oil will give many times its value rather than burning it as energy. And said that you should use your position in the world as a crossroads of continents. You have to utilize that position as a crossroad for world trade, but also as a connection between Africa, Asia, and Europe. And so I added these to the Arabic version because I think this is a very unique area in the world. Not only but its strategic location is very unique. No other part of the world has that. You also have 2/3 of the world energy resources, so-called oil and gas in that region. But also, most importantly, you have about 450 million population. Most of them are young people. And actually, many of them have good education. You also have nations with very ancient history and culture and a very historic identity, like Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and so on, and that they have also an idea of themselves to become key players in the world. But we hope they will become key players in the world in the economic, scientific, and cultural sense. The problem is that all these advantages have been turned into disadvantages. So this region has become a center for global politics, global geopolitics, and that's why we see the conditions we have in the whole Middle East region becoming like this. So our idea is to now we have this new situation with the the Russian intervention, the prospect, the possibility of having a peaceful political solution in Syria, the prospect of uniting many powers to fight the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on, both in Iraq, in Syria, and also in Libya. But what this should be followed, as Helga said, that we need a Marshall Plan. We need an economic development plan to establish peace on true basis. The reason I joined the Schiller Institute in 1994 was I was in Oslo, and I was working as a translator, and there was a Palestinian children delegation coming with Yasser Arafat, and I was going around with them. And at that time, they would have the Oslo peace agreements. A week later, I saw assigned the Schiller Institute have a meeting in Oslo, where they had a very interesting title. But they said in the meeting, if you don't start with the economic development of the Palestinian people, the people in Jordan, Syria, the Israel, and so on, if you don't base the peace process on on a solid economic basis, this whole thing will fail. And the peace process is, of course, dead now, both because of that, but also because of geopolitics, which have prevented reaching a true... so therefore, we need to have to establish true peace, we need an economic, scientific program. Helga referred to President Xi Jinping's visit to the region in January this year, which I consider it a historic turning point, actually, because at that point, in late January, Saudi Arabia and Iran were at the point where there was big risk of a direct war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The beheading of a Shia clergy in Saudi Arabia, which led to demonstrations, the burning of the Saudi embassy in Tehran, and so on. So the Chinese intervention came at a very crucial point where it says, look, all these religious conflicts and problems you have with each other can lead the whole world into a disaster. Why don't we work on our method? We offer you to join the new Silk Road. We offer economic development and technology and even financing, so we can connect all your countries who are in conflict with each other together into this global process. And this is very, very important, and nations in the region have to really grasp that opportunity now and instead of discussing the fate of President Assad, they should discuss, what kinds of economic projects they should work together on. One of the issues I didn't mention is that, for example, even as Helga said, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, they can join this if they stop this other policy, because we have also one of the largest concentrations of financial power in the Gulf countries. The so-called sovereign funds of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, about $2 trillion. This can be transformed into credit. In the report, I propose the establishment of the Arab Infrastructure Investment Bank, a bank which will be directed, financed by these rich countries to have a capital of $100 to $200 billion, and that capital will be only earmarked for infrastructure and development projects. So every nation have a role in this. And in the report also we have added, which is not in the English report, a general outline for reconstruction of Syria by utilizing Syria's position also as a bridge for the Silk Road, both from Asia and from Europe into Africa. We also propose the construction of a Syrian National Reconstruction Bank, which is very important. We have a very important chapter in the report on how nations can internally finance major infrastructure programs. Because the big question which comes all the time when I'm in Arab countries or in Africa, I say, okay, this sounds good. Who will pay for this? Where will the money come from? Actually, you don't really need money in that sense. You can create the money, but you have to know where to use that money. I mean, as Helga said, the central banks in Europe and in the United States, they are pumping massive amounts of liquidity into the financial and banking system. But none of that is transformed into technologies or projects, public projects or housing projects or industrial projects in Europe or anywhere. So money is being printed, but it's not being used. But there is a method, what we call Hamiltonian national credit system, which every nation can actually internally generate credit to finance part of its national development plans. And this is one thing we put in the Syria plan, because every time there is a war, like in Bosnia, in Lebanon, and so on, you have the donor conference where every nation say, we will give you so much money, 100 million, 50 million, but there is no centralized idea of how to rebuild the whole country. It all depends on donations, small drops which come. We want something massive. We want something big. Foreign governments should contribute to that by exporting technology to Syria, for example, which Syria cannot afford to build or afford to buy in the current situation. Also, a part of our plan for the Southwest Asia is to fight against desertification by managing and creating new water resources, stopping the expansion of the desert. This is the Iraqi Green Belt project to stop the effect of sand and dust storms, which are actually a big problem for the many cities in Iraq. It sometimes even reaches into Iran, by building a green belt of planting trees on a large scale belt using both groundwater and water from the rivers. So it's this kind of national program which can unite the people in Iraq for an idea of their future together. It's not Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, Turkish, and so on and so forth. So it's this kind of project, real physical projects, which will challenge people to work together in a country like Iraq. Now, I took this Egyptian model because in Egypt you have a very terrible situation, which is an accumulation of 30 years of destructive economic and financial policies, mostly collaboration by former President Mubarak and Anwar Sadat with the IMF and World Bank. There should be a shift in the way Egyptians consider their economy, because Egypt always waits for the IMF or the World Bank or the EU or the United States to give some money so they can start something new. And usually money does not go to large scale. Europe, the United States, the UN, the IMF, they will never finance large infrastructure projects. That's the policy. Small is beautiful. That's what they say. But in Egypt, you have with the new leadership in Egypt, you have the focus on mega projects, which is a necessity. If you want to save Egypt's economy, you need to build all Egypt's infrastructure. Have to be built from scratch again. There should be new industrial and agricultural centers, which they are focusing on. Using high technology, they try to attract the highest levels of technology, and internal financing. President Assisi, when they wanted to build the Suez Canal, there was no money as usual, they said. So what he did was something unique. He went outside the central bank, he went outside the budget and said, I go on TV and I tell the Egyptian people, we want to build this canal, it's crucial for our nation, we want you to give the money. I mean, in 2013, I wrote a memorandum for Egypt, an Egyptian economic independence document, I called it. Actually, inside Egypt, you can raise more than $100 billion because there are resources inside Egypt. I mean, people, even today, people buy dollar, they take part of the salary, they buy dollar or gold and keep it at home. So that finance disappears from the system. It's not reinvested in the system. people keep their money because of the unstable economic situation. But if you encourage the Egyptian people with this kind of national development projects, which will put their kids to work, unemployed young people, they would come out with the money. And this is what Al-Sisi did. I wrote at the time that they should build a national development bank, not just one fund for the Suez Canal as they did. But as soon as President Al-Sisi came on TV and said, we want to build this canal, but we don't have the money, we want the Egyptian people. So people went out. In 1 week, they raised $8 billion. And people were queuing late in the night. I met a banker last year in Egypt. He said we had to stay open into the night because people were queuing at the bank to buy the bonds. I mean, Egyptians are real patriots. You know, they love their country, but if they're encouraged by good leadership, of course, the Suez Canal now is not giving back what it was supposed to be already from the beginning, because the world trade has collapsed. The level of transit in the Suez Canal has gone down, not both because of Egypt's policy, but because the world economy is going down. Trade, global trade, has been collapsing. But the idea is that using the Suez Canal as a development zone. And this is what I got from people in the Suez Canal Authority, that they're not only thinking about transport of goods, but they want to utilize that route to build new industrial zones around the canal, like we showed in the development corridor idea. And of course, Egypt has a very key role in both in the Arab world. It's the most important Arab country, and also in Africa. Now, Egypt has one big problem. It's the demographic problem. People say Egypt is overpopulated. That's not true. Egypt is not overpopulated. Cairo is overcrowded. I mean, 90 million people live on only 5% of the land of Egypt. 95% of the land of Egypt is empty. It's not used. But it's not overpopulated. The United States and Europe have been financing the Egyptian government hundreds of millions of dollars for family planning, so that women will have less children. But no projects were built to expand Egypt's economic potential to accommodate to the new generations, so they can have new agricultural and urban centers out in the desert. This is after I was in Egypt last year, I wrote a report about there was a major economic conference in Egypt to attract investment. But these are the ideas which came out of both the conference, but also my observations of Egypt's role on the New Silk Road. I mean, in Egypt, people were very negative to the idea of the New Silk Road because they said the transshipment on the Silk Road will take away trade from the Suez Canal. That shipments will go from Asia to Europe by land, and that we will lose. So there are a lot of people in Egypt who were actually against the idea. But I was telling people, look, it's not about trade. If you have economic development, you will need more Suez canals to accommodate to the trade. But if the world economy is not growing, there is no development, there will be no trade. And people will compete on attracting trade into other areas. So the idea is to develop Egypt's economy, but also contribute to more development and more trade among nations. And it's utilizing Egypt's position to connect to sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and to the Arabian Peninsula. Interestingly, after I was in Egypt, last week the Saudi king was in Egypt, and they decided to build this that Sharm el-Sheikh, there is the connection over the Gulf of Aqaba. So I think the Egyptian president invited the Saudi king to support the building of this a bridge between the Saudi territories and southern Sinai, which will turn Sinai from an isolated area. Suddenly it will become in the center of between two major economies. There is now big problems in Egypt because the president made a terrible mistake by conceding sovereignty over the Tiran and Sanafir island to the Saudis. There was a dispute between the two countries many years, but the President Al-Sisi suddenly declared that it's Saudi islands, and now there's a big uproar in Egypt. And the mistake was that there was no public discussion about it. The parliament didn't have anything to say about this. So now there will be a review of the agreement in the... But the idea of this, the project is very important. Now, for Egypt to get out of that democratic box is for Egypt to expand its economic activities into the desert. This is the development corridor by Dr. Farouk Elbaz. He's a space scientist, and he's right now advisor to the president. And he designed this idea of creating the new valley, the new Nile Valley, by building railway, roads, and new urban centers. I added these green zones because these are actually becoming new agricultural areas which the Egyptian government want to invest in by creating new farmlands. I think they're talking about 4 million acres of land, and settle young people into these regions and build new agro-industrial centers. But what is needed is to extend the development corridor, the black line, into the economic zones. Now, this is the Africa Pass. One of our Egyptian friends, an engineer, he presented this in our conference in 2012. It's the same idea, connecting Egypt to North Africa, to Europe, and into the Great Lakes region. Now, the Great Lakes region countries like Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern Congo, Uganda, they have massive problems of economic development, also because they are very far from the transport corridors of the world. We wrote a series of reports 2 years ago about the cost of shipment of a container. It's a Maersk Muller have statistics. The cost of a shipment of a container from Singapore to Alexandria is about $4,000. To Mombasa in Kenya, in eastern Kenya, becomes $5,000. But to capital of Uganda, it goes to $8,000 because there are no good roads to ship that container. Into Rwanda and Burundi, it reaches $10,600 per container. So they cannot bear the cost of shipment of containers that maybe have technology inside them and machines. And that's a major problem for these so-called landlocked countries. So you need to have new lines of transport, which will reduce the cost of the transport. Now, these are ideas which the African nations, African Union have had for many years. There are many very nice plans, but the attitude of the rest of the world to Africa, because Africa by itself does not have the technology, at least, to build these projects, and there has been no willingness in Europe or the United States to finance or contribute to build any of these major reports, to integrate the infrastructure, the infrastructures of Africa, and enhance economic development. Because without infrastructure, you cannot have economic development. But some of these lines are now coming on the agenda, thanks to the intervention of the BRICS nations and also of China. For example, the Cairo-Cape Town highway idea, President Jacob Zuma of South Africa, he presented this actually twice at the BRICS summits in 2013 and 2014, and he said, this is a key element in the development of Africa. We need to work with the BRICS nations and China and Russia and India to build these projects. There are 400 road and rail projects involved in this. But this is a big challenge, both in terms of financing and in terms of technology. There is also the possibility of connecting the river systems of Africa for river transport, like in Europe. The Main, Rhine, Danube rivers are an important transport artery and development artery. In the same way you can connect the Nile to the Great Lakes, to the Zambezi River through a number of canals and what's so-called transmodal transport systems, where you can ship from rivers to rail, back to rivers, to lakes, and so on, in an easy way. So then, filling the gap which the United States and Europe have left for many, many years. Now, the Chinese, in Europe we have a very problematic and twisted relationship to poverty or poor countries, underdeveloped countries. Europeans, and they look at Africa as a burden. It's a problem. How do we solve this problem? But the problem is that the whole focus has been on aid, emergency, relief, and so on and so forth, but that really doesn't solve problems. I mean, in Africa you have, people talk about genocide. In Africa you have every year 4 million children die. Talk about a war crime. 700,000 children before 5 die every year in Africa. So you cannot solve these problems by, small aid projects here and there. You need to think big. You need to provide those people with the adequate transport, electricity, water systems. And this cannot be done by so-called aid programs. In Africa, 600 million people don't have access to electricity out of 1 billion. But you look at the Chinese, where they look at an underdeveloped country, they see an opportunity. They see potential. They see a win-win strategy, new markets, new areas of development, and they should intervene in that situation. This is the same idea which President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States had. All his fights with Churchill was about exactly this problem. Roosevelt told Churchill in the middle of the World War II is that you British are very stupid because you suck the blood of the Africans and you get pennies. You get nothing by sucking their blood. But if you develop Africa as independent nations, as modern nations, as we did with the United States, then you will gain much, much, much more. If you treat them human, if you develop their infrastructure and schools and hospitals. And this is exactly what the Chinese are thinking about. They see, out of the problem, they see an opportunity. And this is Prime Minister Li Shiqiang, I don't know was the correct pronunciation, but he was in East Africa and also in Nigeria in May 2014. And they immediately said, we want to help Africa connect all the capitals of Africa with railways, which is the big deficit problem. And they started from East Africa. Now there are projects being built from Lamu, a new port, into the landlocked South Sudan, into Uganda, into Rwanda and Burundi. And China is both financing major part of this, but also contributing to building it, to solve the problems of the landlocked countries and the need for development. China recently completed, it's not running yet, but part of the railway is running from Djibouti to Addis Ababa. There's an old railway which is not functional, built by the French colonialists, but now there's a new electrified railway, goes from Djibouti to Addis Ababa. And two interesting things about this railway is that Ethiopia is always associated with famine and food problems. Some of these problems still exist. Now these are being on the way to be resolved. But to bring food from the ports to inside the country usually took 2 months because of the lack of infrastructure. So starving people could not have food in time. Even if the food existed on the port coming from around the world in Djibouti, it was almost impossible to bring the food to the people who needed them. Now that food can be shipped in 10 hours to the capital and also to other areas. The other interesting, of course, fact of this railway is that China is not simply just building the railway and financing, but also training and educating engineers and workers to run these systems. Now Ethiopia has a massive infrastructure, sorry, it's a bad picture, but the Ethiopians themselves, they have a massive plan for connecting all the major cities of Ethiopia with the railway and roads. The other thing about this railway thing is that it is all electrified. And the Ethiopians will use all these new dams they are building to electrify the railways. So they don't need to import oil and gas and diesel to run the railway system. They will domestically provide the energy to run the trains. So Ethiopia will, I'm very sure, it will never be associated anymore with famine and poverty. Ethiopia is a great nation, a very proud nation. They have massive resources, but these resources have been dormant, not been utilized. But now with the Chinese intervention, and also India is active there, these resources will be developed. And, this is just a metaphorical picture. This is the Mombasa-Nairobi railway being built by Chinese and a Kenyan worker. And there's this in Africa, or the propaganda goes that the Chinese never let the locals work in these projects. They bring their own workers, they bring their own engineers, their own technology. They build the thing and then they leave. It's not true. They always involve local workers. They train them because they cannot run these systems. The locals will have to run these systems themselves. But they're also training the labor force in Uganda. They are building an army corps of engineers. So the army can play a positive role in the development of the country. I mean, traditionally, the Army Corps of Engineers play a very important role, even in advanced countries. So this is also part of the same project. The other important project for Africa, for infrastructure, is Transaqua. The Lake Chad is drying up, which is a known fact, and 30 million people are affected because they live as fishermen or they have grazing land around the lake. In Chad, in Nigeria, Niger, all these countries are affected. There are 30 million people around that region, and there will be massive migration actually from the Lake Chad region. So there's an idea, it's called Transaqua, by one of our friends, an Italian engineer, to bring 5% of the water from the Congo River, or the tributaries of the Congo River, and build a canal, 2,800 kilometers long canal, into the Chari River, and then flow downwards into the Lake Chad to refill the lake, but also to have a new economic zone and use or build the road, the Mombasa-Lagos highway, which was one of the plans I showed earlier. So you can transform that part of Africa, which is people's ideas, just complete jungle, into a new economic zone. But also to bring water to the Lake Chad region. I'm sorry, I have to go a bit quickly. There are some other issues I wanted to take. It's one of the problems, one of the big deficits in Africa, of course, is the energy consumption. And as I said, not everybody has that. I mean, the average international level of energy consumption is about 2,800, but that's not equal. The only two countries who was an exception were South Africa and Libya before that. So the energy needs in Africa are enormous. I mean, Africa has a lot of wealth, but also the hydropower potential, which has never been built, and so on. But the attitude of the Western countries, like the Obama administration, they have something called Power Africa Initiative. You know, that every nation will have, they will have certain nations in Africa to get energy provided, but they're not what they're talking about. They're not talking about hydropower. They're not talking about nuclear power. They're not talking about coal or gas or so on. They're talking about so-called renewable and sustainable energy. And the International Energy Agency have a criteria for access to energy, which is a modern access to energy, is about 100 kilowatt hour per year per person. And this diagram shows very ironically that amount will be consumed by an American in 3 days. But they expect Africans to live with that for a whole year. Is just one more ironical idea. One refrigerator can consume many times than an Ethiopian individual. These are the criteria for the Power Africa, President Obama's plan for Africa, that the plan will eventually help these nations come to this line, while the real needs are that big now, and they will be that big in a few years. So all these ideas to help Africa, which the Obama administration, they are not adequate. I mean, this is just a complete bluff. It does not help if you really look at the numbers. And this is also another irony of the Obama administration policy. These are the sources of energy for the American people or American economy. and these what the Obama administration doesn't want you to do. So they say, do as we say, not as we do. So the United States produces 37% of its energy from coal. That's forbidden for Africa. 30% produced by natural gas. That's a very cautious policy because there's the carbon problem. 19% nuclear, absolutely no nuclear for Africa. 7% hydropower. The United States is very suspicious to hydropower projects and so on and so on. So what is left is solar, so-called geothermal and biomass, which the United States produce only 0.1 of its needs. But that's recommended for Africa. Yeah. So anyway, the idea is that if Africa joins this new paradigm shift, African nations, they have exactly, and African families and African individuals have exactly the same needs as we have in Europe or in the United States. There's absolutely no difference. So trying to convince the Africans that they should just, maybe if they are lucky, they could get a light bulb at home so the kids can read by having a solar battery, they will not buy it. I mean, if you bring electricity to a village, what people will do is not simply to have a light bulb. If you bring electricity to a village, and one of our friends made a study in India, is that people will start to want to use new devices. Then you have to have other appliances at home. You need to have a stove, so women don't have to go many hours and cut trees and come home and cook with the wood and suffocate with the smoke. They would need farmers will have to have tractors. You will need to have workshops which use electricity. People will want to have TV sets, computers. They want to build industrial projects. They will need refrigeration, which is a big problem in Africa because most of the food produced in the sub-Saharan goes wasted because there's no refrigeration. So just to give yourself an illusion is that you will provide every African with a light bulb, just forget about it. Because the needs of those people are so immense, and they will not give up on their right of having a living standard which is similar to us. Why shouldn't they have it? And this is what, here, the ideology in Europe and the United States say, no, you should not have this kind of technology, should not have this kind of development in Africa, because that's not sustainable, which is not true. It is sustainable if you provide the tools and the technology to do that. Actually, in Africa, there are more resources than in Japan or the United States and Europe to sustain industrial development. So the problem is in the policy. The problem is in how they look at Africa and how they look at the problem of poverty and so on. And that has also to change. Exactly as we change with geopolitics, we have to change our attitude to the problems of Africa and have really the right methods to solving them, and treating African nations as equal to us, and African families as equal to us, and African individuals as equal to us. Nobody here will give up their living standard and live in the forest. Maybe some people do. There are some Danes and Norwegians. But we want to have education. We want to have warm houses. We want to have clean water. We want to have a future for our kids. We want to have trains which go on time. This is what the Africans want. There's nothing different. We are all one human race. So when you design policy and you say, no, Africa should have sustainable energy, not nuclear power, then you are breaking with that real idea of a human family and equality. So I think I stop here. So.
We are a little bit over the time. We'll rush on to a presentation by Mr. Abbas Rasouli, the Silk Road and the Iron Factor, and Mr. Rasouli is the first secretary at the Embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran here in Copenhagen. So, please. Would you want to put a microphone on? Shall we?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Schiller Institute and all the organizers for arranging this session. I'm going to tell you a bit about the New Silk Road and Iran's role in it, plus a little about the other corridor, the North-South corridor. And before that, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Jamshid, who helped me in this regard. And for complete this help, he will answer to a question at the end. The Silk Road and the Iran factor. In 2013, China proposed to build an economic belt along the Silk Road, a trans-Eurasian project spanning from the Pacific Ocean to the Central Asia countries all the way to Europe. The New Silk Road already have momentum. In early 2015, China announced $62 billion of its foreign exchange reserves will be made available to the 3 state-owned policy banks that will finance the expansion of the New Silk Road. Beyond Central Asia, the economic belt along the Silk Road can also provide a vehicle for China's expansion of its trade relations with both the Middle East and Europe. And here is when the Iran link comes into the equation. In February 2016, a freight train from Yiwu in China's eastern Zhejiang province arrived in Tehran. The China-Iran Silk Road train is a part of the overland component of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. The train used the existing rail link from China through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan before entering Iran. It took the train just 14 days to cover the roughly 10,399 kilometer long journey to Tehran, whereas ferrying cargo via the sea from Shanghai, which lies 300 kilometers north of Yiwu to the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas, takes 45 days in comparison. It is expected that construction of new high-speed rail links through Central Asia will enable train carrying goods to run further on to European markets. Besides facilitating Sino-Iran trade, these railway lines will contribute to Iran's emergence as an important Eurasian trade hub. Iran will thus be integrated more into the economies of East and Central Asia as well as Europe. Bilateral trade between Iran and China grew from $4 billion in 2003 to $53 billion in 2013. In January 2016, during the visit of Chinese President to Iran, the two sides agreed to increase trade to $600 billion over the coming decade. So the operation of this railway link will prove an important factor in the development of trade between Iran and the countries along this economic belt. The important thing about the Iran corridor is that existing road and rail link between China, Central Asia, and Iran only needs to be modernized, whereas some parts of all the other corridors have to be constructed from scratch, each with their own security and geographical challenges. The Yiwu-Tehran Railway is just one of the many projects that enhance regional connectivity, bringing together China, Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and West Asia. India has also been eyeing overland access via Iran to Central Asia and European markets too. In this connection, the North-South Transport Corridor (NSTC), a multimodal trade transport network that includes sea and rail transport from India via Iran ports on the Persian Gulf to as far as the Baltic Sea via Russia, was initiated by Russia, India, and Iran in September 2000 to establish transportation networks among the member states and to enhance connectivity with the landlocked region of Central Asia. Among the few routes in this corridor, the Mumbai Chahbahar or Bandar Abbas, Persian Gulf, Anzali Astara, Iran Caspian Sea, Astara, Azerbaijan, Baku, Russia, Kazakhstan is receiving much attention. With the completion of this route, Iran will emerge as another important transit hub in the Asia-Europe trade, giving India overland access to Europe as well. After 1,500 kilometer Bandar Abbas Bandar Anzali railway link, only 50 kilometers remains to be completed. But the 164 kilometer Anzali Astara link is still at negotiation stage. A working group made up of India, Iran, Azerbaijan, and Russia has been formed to look into raising finance to construct the Anzali Astara Iran Astara Azerbaijan railway connection. All parties appreciate the urgency of moving this project forward, and as recently as last week, Russia, Azerbaijan, and Iran agreed to speed up the project. The North-South corridor, when completed, is expected to significantly reduce the time of cargo transport from India to Central Asia and Russia. At present, it takes about 40 days to ship goods from Mumbai in India to Moscow. The new route will be able to cut this time to 14 days. The primary objective of the NSTC project is to reduce costs in terms of time and money over the traditional route currently being used between Russia, Central Asia, Iran, and India. With improved transport connectivity, their respective bilateral trade volumes are most likely to increase tremendously. According to various studies, the route, once fully operational, will be at least 30% cheaper and 40% shorter than the current traditional route. Though every country is important in any transport chain, Iran, neighbor with 15 countries, is not only a hub for distribution to the neighboring countries of about 400 million, but has the added advantage of being a strong economy between giants at each end of these corridors, namely China, India, Russia, and Europe. Some of the economic advantages of Iran are the 18th largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity, a diversified economy with a broad industrial base, resource-rich economy, labor-rich economy, young and educated population, large domestic market, an increasingly sophisticated infrastructure and human capital base providing the foundation for an emerging knowledge-based economy, a market of 18 million with easy access to another market of 400 million. In a global world where international trade is taking on greater significance, transport costs and delivery time are two of the most important factors in the choice of the mode and route of transporting goods. The completion and modernization of the north-south and east-western transport corridors will cut transport costs and delivery time, thereby enhancing trade between East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, and Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Rasouli.